It was a stormy night when Sarah found herself standing alone on a quiet, deserted road. The rain came down in heavy sheets, blurring the world around her. She had been on her way home from a friend's house when her car broke down. She had no choice but to wait for help. There was no sign of life on the road, no houses, no passing cars. Just the constant roar of the rain and the occasional flash of lightning. As she checked her phone, she saw that there was no signal. Panic began to rise in her chest, and she shivered from the cold. She didn't know how long she had been standing there when, just as hope began to fade, she saw headlights in the distance. A taxi. The yellow car slowly came closer, its tires making a hissing sound as they cut through the wet road. It seemed to appear out of nowhere, as if it had materialized from the darkness itself. She waved her hand, relieved to see someone willing to help. The car came to a stop just in front of her. The windows were rolled up, and the driver didn't seem to notice her at first. He didn't open the door or say anything. After a few seconds, the passenger window rolled down, and a cold gust of wind blew inside. The driver was an older man, his skin pale and wrinkled. His eyes, a piercing blue, looked right at her but didn't seem to focus. There was something unsettling about his expression, but she was too cold and desperate to care. "You need a ride?" he asked in a raspy voice, his words hanging in the air like a faint echo. Sarah hesitated for a moment. Something about him made her uneasy, but it wasn't like she had much of a choice. The storm was getting worse, and she didn't want to be stranded out here any longer. "Yeah, please. I need to get home," she said, trying to sound calm. Without saying anything else, the driver nodded and unlocked the doors. Sarah quickly got in, grateful for the warmth inside the car. The interior smelled faintly of musty leather, and the faint hum of the engine was the only sound as they began to drive. The storm seemed to be worsening, the rain pounding against the windows with more force. Sarah glanced at the driver. His hands were gripping the wheel tightly, his knuckles white. His eyes never left the road ahead, and he seemed completely still, almost as if he were waiting for something. His silence was deafening. "So, where are you heading?" she asked, trying to make conversation and ease the growing tension. The driver didn't respond. Sarah's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, but to her shock, there was no reflection of the driver. No reflection at all. Her breath caught in her throat. She quickly looked away, telling herself it was just a trick of the light. But as the minutes passed, an unsettling feeling grew inside her. The longer she sat there, the more she realized something wasn't right. The streets around her seemed unfamiliar, the houses few and far between. It was as if the driver knew the road better than anyone, like he was taking her somewhere she didn't want to go. The ride felt endless. The storm outside had only worsened, the rain now pouring in sheets against the windows. Sarah sat back in her seat, her eyes glued to the road ahead, but her mind kept racing. The eerie silence in the car was suffocating, and the only sound was the steady hum of the engine. It was as if the world outside had disappeared, leaving her trapped in this suffocating cocoon of isolation. She glanced at the driver again. His hands gripped the wheel so tightly that his knuckles were white. He hadn't said a word since she got in, and his eyes were fixed on the road, unblinking. His face remained expressionless, though she could feel a strange, almost oppressive energy radiating from him. She shifted uncomfortably in her seat, trying to push away the creeping feeling of unease that was slowly taking over her. "Where are we?" she asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't recognize this place." The driver didn't respond. The only acknowledgement she received was a slight tightening of his grip on the wheel, as if her question had unsettled him. Sarah's heart began to race. The further they went, the more unfamiliar the surroundings became. There were no streetlights, no familiar landmarks, just endless rows of empty, decaying buildings and barren streets. She tried to peer through the fogged windows, but the darkness outside seemed impenetrable. Her breath fogged up the glass as she wiped it clean, looking for some sign of civilization. But there was nothing, just darkness and rain, endless and unyielding. As the taxi drove deeper into the night, Sarah's unease turned into full-blown anxiety. The buildings around her looked older, abandoned even, like something out of a nightmare. Her mind raced as she tried to figure out where the driver was taking her. Was this the right way? She couldn't remember a single turn they'd made. Suddenly, she saw something in the corner of her eye. A movement in the distance. She turned her head, only to see nothing but shadows. Her eyes darted back to the rearview mirror. The reflection was gone again. No driver. No reflection of herself. Just empty space. A chill ran down her spine. She quickly looked at the driver again. His eyes were locked on the road, unblinking. There was something strange about his face, something that didn't seem quite human. His skin was too pale, his features too sharp. Sarah felt the hair on the back of her neck stand up. She was no longer sure if the man was real or if she was imagining it all. "Where are we going?" she repeated, this time with more urgency, but the driver remained silent. The taxi seemed to be driving through an endless void, and Sarah realized she was no longer certain whether she was on a road or trapped in some strange, inescapable nightmare. The feeling of being watched, unseen eyes lurking in the shadows, pressed against her chest. She couldn't escape it, no matter how hard she tried. The taxi continued to move through the dark, deserted streets, the tires screeching on the wet road as the rain fell harder. Sarah's nerves were shot. She had no idea where they were or how much longer this ride would last. The eerie stillness inside the car was maddening, and every glance she took outside only made her feel more isolated, like the world was slipping away. "Excuse me," Sarah finally said, her voice shaky. "Could you please tell me where we're going?" The driver didn't respond. His hands remained tightly clutching the wheel, and his eyes stayed fixed on the road ahead, never once straying from their path. It felt as though he hadn't even heard her. The silence between them seemed suffocating, and the tension in the air made it hard for Sarah to breathe. Every passing second felt like an eternity. The streets seemed to stretch on endlessly. She had been in the taxi for what felt like hours, but there were no signs of life, no other cars, no streetlights, nothing. It was as if the entire world had disappeared, leaving just her and this strange, silent driver. The rain pounded relentlessly against the car, but even it couldn't break the heavy silence that had settled inside. Eventually, the taxi slowed and turned down a narrow, winding road. Sarah hadn't seen it before. The houses that lined the street were old and crumbling, their windows broken and covered with layers of dirt. The air was thick with decay, and an overwhelming sense of dread began to settle in her stomach. She tried to calm herself, telling herself it was just a bad neighborhood, but deep down, she knew something wasn't right. As they passed an overgrown garden, Sarah noticed a large, decrepit house at the end of the street. It stood alone, its windows dark and hollow, the front door hanging ajar. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up. She couldn't explain why, but she felt an icy chill run through her as they drew closer to the house. The taxi pulled to a stop in front of it. For a moment, Sarah just stared at the house, unsure of what was happening. Her heart pounded in her chest. She tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. It was locked. "Please, let me out," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but the driver said nothing. He didn't even move. The silence was unbearable. She tried again, pushing harder against the door, but it was as if it had become a part of the car. The handle wouldn't budge, and the window was sealed tight. Panic began to rise in her throat. "Why won't you let me out?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling with fear. The driver finally turned to her. His face was emotionless, his eyes cold and empty. He smiled, but it wasn't a reassuring smile, it was something much darker. "You're not leaving until it's time," he said, his voice low and rasping. The words sent a shiver down Sarah's spine. She looked around desperately, but all she saw was the dark house looming over her. The taxi had stopped in front of it, but the road ahead seemed to stretch into an endless void. She was trapped. The driver's eerie smile grew wider, his eyes gleaming with something Sarah couldn't understand. Something ancient. Something far too familiar. Her chest tightened with fear. She had no idea what was happening, but she knew one thing for sure, she was no longer in control of her fate. Sarah's pulse hammered in her ears as the driver's words echoed in her mind. "You're not leaving until it's time." The chill in his voice made her skin crawl, and she felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over her. She tried to pull the door open again, but it was no use. The handle was unyielding, the door locked tight, as if it had been sealed shut by some invisible force. Panic began to rise in her chest. She looked around desperately, her eyes landing on the old, decaying house across the street. The windows were dark, but she could have sworn she saw movement behind one of them. A shadow, or maybe just the wind, but it felt as though something, or someone, was watching her. Her breath quickened as she turned back to the driver, who remained eerily calm, his pale face illuminated by the dim glow of the streetlights. "What do you mean, until it's time?" she demanded, her voice shaky. "Where are you taking me?" The driver didn't answer. Instead, he turned his head slightly toward her, and Sarah felt a coldness radiate from his eyes. His gaze was distant, unfocused, like he was looking right through her. He didn't look human. There was something unnatural about him, his skin too pale, his features too sharp. His smile was unnerving, a thin, tight curl of his lips that didn't reach his eyes. Her throat tightened, and she suddenly realized how dry her mouth had become. She could feel her heartbeat in her chest, but the fear creeping up her spine was far stronger than the panic. The feeling of being trapped here, alone in the taxi with this strange driver, was consuming her. "Who are you?" Sarah whispered, though the question felt pointless. She already had a sense that it didn't matter. The driver didn't respond immediately. Instead, he slowly turned his attention back to the road, his eyes still fixed ahead. For a moment, there was only the sound of the rain tapping against the windows and the hum of the engine. Then, the driver spoke in a low, almost sing-song voice. "I've been here longer than you can imagine," he said, his voice growing colder with each word. "And I've taken many before you. You're just another passenger, another soul to be collected." The words hit Sarah like a punch to the gut. Her heart skipped a beat as she tried to process what he was saying. "Collected? What do you mean?" The driver's lips curled into a twisted smile, but his eyes never left the road. "I don't drive people to their destinations. I drive them to their end." A sickening realization swept over her. The truth was dawning on her, she wasn't just in any taxi. This car, this driver, they weren't of this world. She had heard rumors, old stories, whispers about cursed taxis that roamed the streets at night, picking up lost souls. But she never believed them. Not until now. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Her hands trembled as she clutched the seat beneath her. The driver's words sank deep into her mind, and she suddenly understood what he meant. She wasn't just stuck in a strange car with an eerie driver. She was being driven to her death. "Please, I don't want to die," she pleaded, her voice barely audible. But the driver said nothing. His smile deepened, and Sarah felt the temperature in the car drop, a coldness creeping into her bones. Her body stiffened as an overwhelming wave of fear washed over her. The truth was clear now, she wasn't going to make it out of this taxi. Sarah's heart raced. The driver's words echoed in her mind, twisting like a dark cloud. "I drive them to their end." She was paralyzed, frozen in fear, but deep inside her, a spark of determination flared. She had to escape, she had to try. If she didn't, she knew she would never leave this place alive. Her eyes darted around the taxi, looking for something, anything, that could help her. The handles, the window, the door, everything was locked. The driver had made sure of that. She wasn't just in a regular car, this was a prison, a vehicle that would take her to a fate she didn't understand but feared all the same. The rain outside had picked up again, the pounding of it against the roof growing louder. The wind howled in the distance, and for a moment, Sarah almost thought she could hear whispers in the noise, a voice calling her name from the darkness. She shook her head, trying to shake off the panic that was threatening to overwhelm her. The driver's eyes remained focused on the road, his face expressionless. But something in his silence made Sarah feel more desperate, more trapped. His grip on the wheel hadn't loosened, and his pale hands remained firm, as though he was holding something, or someone, back. "Please," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "Just let me go. I won't tell anyone. Just let me leave." The driver didn't respond. She had learned by now that his silence was the most terrifying thing of all. It was as if he was immune to her fear, unaffected by her pleading. Suddenly, a plan began to form in her mind. She couldn't just sit there and wait for the inevitable. She had to take action. Her hands were still trembling, but she steeled herself and began to work on the window. She pressed her palm against the glass, feeling the cold of it. Slowly, she reached into the corner of the door, where the small gap between the doorframe and window gave her just enough space to slide her fingers into. It was tight, but she wasn't giving up. She yanked at the window lock, her fingers slipping against the wet metal, but she didn't stop. She focused on the task, her heart pounding in her ears. As her hand moved, she could feel the car slowing down, the tires humming against the wet road. She had to act quickly. She glanced nervously at the driver. His face was still unchanged, his eyes unblinking, but Sarah felt his awareness in the air, like he knew what she was doing. Finally, with a jolt, the window popped open slightly. It wasn't much, but it was enough. She could feel the cold night air rush in, carrying with it the smell of rain and earth. A wave of panic hit her, but she fought it down. She needed to get out. She needed to escape. Before she could think twice, Sarah pushed herself against the door with all her strength, forcing it to open just enough to squeeze through. The car was still moving slowly, but she didn't care. The moment the door cracked, she shoved herself through the small gap, her body falling into the mud outside. For a second, she thought she was free. She scrambled to her feet, the mud sticking to her shoes, her body shaking with fear. But as she looked around, she realized the nightmare wasn't over. The taxi had stopped, but the driver wasn't getting out. Instead, he turned his head to look at her through the window, his eyes cold and unblinking. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She could see the faint outline of his figure in the darkness, standing behind the wheel, motionless. Then, the engine roared to life again, and the taxi moved toward her. Her legs froze. She knew she wasn't free, not yet. "Run," a voice whispered in her head. The same voice she'd heard before, distant and cold. The voice of someone who had been trapped here before her. But Sarah didn't run. She stood there, frozen, staring at the driver's vacant eyes as the taxi's headlights illuminated her face. She wasn't escaping. Not now. The taxi's headlights blazed like twin suns, casting long shadows across the muddy ground. Sarah stood frozen, the cold air biting at her skin, her heart pounding in her chest. Her legs felt like they were made of stone, unable to move, unable to escape. The car had stopped just a few feet from her, and the driver's eyes were locked onto her, unblinking, cold, and empty. She wanted to run, to escape, but her body refused to obey. Every instinct told her to flee, but something deep inside her held her in place, paralyzed with fear. The driver didn't speak. He just watched her, the silence between them growing heavier with each passing second. The rain had slowed, but the air still felt thick with dread. Sarah's breath came in shallow gasps as she looked around, searching for something, anything, that could help her. But the street was empty, the crumbling houses standing like silent sentinels, as if the world itself had forgotten her. The driver finally broke the silence. His voice was low, almost gentle, but there was no kindness in it. "You're not going to run," he said, his tone matter of fact. "You can't. No one ever does." Sarah's mind raced. What did he mean? Was this some sort of twisted game? The stories she had heard, stories about haunted taxis, lost souls, trapped passengers, flashed through her mind. But none of them had prepared her for this. She wasn't just a passenger. She wasn't just lost. The driver's eyes never left her. Slowly, he opened the door, stepping out of the car. His movements were deliberate, almost graceful, as if he had all the time in the world. The air seemed to grow colder as he approached her, and Sarah instinctively took a step back, her fear pushing her toward the shadows. "You're part of this now," he said, his voice a chilling whisper. "You always have been." A wave of realization hit Sarah like a slap to the face. She had been part of this, the taxi, the driver, the endless road, all of it. From the moment she had gotten in, she had sealed her fate. The car wasn't just taking her somewhere, it was taking her to the end, to the place where the lost souls went. She had known it deep down, but now, in this moment, the truth was undeniable. The driver reached out, his cold hand gripping her arm with surprising strength. There was no escape now. No second chances. "Please, no," Sarah whispered, tears welling in her eyes as she felt the weight of her fate crashing down on her. But the driver didn't answer. He simply pulled her toward the taxi. The car's door opened on its own, and Sarah's feet seemed to move without her control, as if the car had become a force greater than her will. The world around her blurred, the air thickening, the darkness pressing in. The last thing she saw before she was pulled into the taxi was the house, standing in the distance like a silent observer, and the moon hanging low in the sky, casting its pale light over everything. As the door slammed shut, Sarah felt a strange, suffocating weight settle over her chest. She was no longer on the road she had known, no longer in control of her destiny. There was no escape now. No way out. And as the taxi slowly pulled away, the sound of the engine echoed in the empty night, a reminder that no one who had entered this car had ever left. The road to nowhere had claimed another soul. As the darkness closes in, our journey tonight comes to an end, but the shadows still whisper their secrets, and some stories are better left untold, or are they? If you've made it this far, you've felt the chill of the unknown, and remember, this won't be our last meeting. The night is never truly silent, and there's always something lurking, watching, waiting. Until we cross paths again, stay vigilant, and sleep tight, if you can. If you enjoy this story, so please subscribe my channel and set bell icon on all. Also share my video to others and like my video as appreciation. Thanks.